Today, we will be reading from the Keystone Finish Line book, pages 160 to 163. These pages are also available for you to read by yourself. You can follow along if you like. But normally, I would be reading this with you. We will all be taking turns in class so that I can stop and explain things. So I still will be doing that today. We are in Unit 7, Theory of Evolution. Three things we're going to be talking about today: mechanisms of evolution, meaning what causes evolution to happen; evidence of evolution, self-explanatory; and some scientific terminology I'm not going to spend too much time on because I've already talked about this in a previous video. So, mechanisms of evolution is what we're focusing on today. Species are defined by genetic characteristics. Each species has a typical number of chromosomes and a particular set of genes. Within a species, however, organisms differ. Because individuals have different alleles, versions of genes, they have different traits, or different alleles, different traits. As species evolve over time, some traits and the alleles that cause them become more common and others disappear entirely. A precise definition of evolution is the change in allele frequency over time. Okay, I'm going to stop there and explain that because we're going to have a project on this word, allele frequency. A frequency is how often something shows up. You know, I have a percentage, 100% of the time, 50% of the time, 20% of the time. How often do they show up in the population? So an allele frequency is how often certain alleles show up in our population. Evolution is when the allele frequency of a certain allele changes. So the question is, what is going to cause that change in allele frequency? What's going to cause a change in our population's genetics? One of those things is natural selection. Okay. So natural selection and the peppered moth. One mechanism that drives evolution is natural selection, the process by which certain individuals are more likely to survive and reproduce, leading to changes in the allele of a population of a species. Right? Meaning, some animals, their traits are better than their siblings. So they get to survive and reproduce, their siblings don't. So the next generation will have the better genes. That's natural selection. Who gets to survive? Who gets to reproduce? That's natural selection. A classic example of natural selection is the change in coloration of the peppered moth, Biston betularia. I'm sure I mispronounced that. Prior to the 1800s, most peppered moths in the United Kingdom were gray with black speckles. This coloring helped to camouflage the moths against the lichen-covered trees of the moth's environment, helping to avoid predators. Lichen is a kind of fungusy moss stuff, right? It grows on trees. So they were lichen colored. They blended in. Then coal burning factories were built near the UK cities during the Industrial Revolution. Coal burning releases soot, brown powder black powder that settles on the trees, darkening the bark and killing the lichens. So no more lichen, darker bark. So these lighter colored moths no longer blended in. They stood out. Animals were eating them. In 1848, the first black colored pepper moth was observed and recorded in England. By 1900, most pepper moths in the industrial areas were black. The speckled phenotype still occurs in rural areas, meaning you can still find the lighter colored one where there are no factories. Where there is factories, you'll find the black ones. The black moth phenotype is an example of an adaptation, a behavior or characteristic that helps an individual to survive and reproduce in its environment. Guys, I'm going to stop and explain that for a second. We typically use the word adaptation wrong. Right? When we say adaptation, people think it means to change. It does not. An adaptation is not a verb. It's not something you do. It's something that you have. It is a noun. An adaptation is a thing that you have, some aspect of your body that helps you survive. Human adaptation would be our opposable thumbs or our very large brains. When the environment changed, a solid black phenotype helped camouflage the moth against the blackened tree barks. Moths with this phenotype were more likely to survive and produce offspring than the moths with a speckled phenotype. As a result, a greater fraction of the next generation inherited the black phenotype. The moth population in the industrial area successfully adapted to the change in the environment. So we have these lighter color moths and the darker color moths. It used to be these guys survived better because they blended in with the trees. Then the trees turned black. So these guys didn't blend in. The animals ate them. Birds ate them. Whatever eats moss ate them. These guys did blend in with the new black trees, so they didn't get eaten. They survived, they reproduced, and now we get a whole bunch of them. That's natural selection. If you are able to survive, you are able to reproduce. The next generation looks more like you. Explain why the change in color pepper moths is an example of evolution, but the change in the color of tree bark in the same region is not. Right? So why was the moth changing color an example of evolution, but the tree bark changing color not? That's because evolution is a change in the allele frequencies. It is a genetic change in the population. That is evolution occurs. I can't talk today. That is evolutionary change occurs at the genetic level across a population as a whole. Because more black moths than gray moths survived and reproduced, the moth population gradually became darker over several generations. The trees changed color because environmental factors, not genetic reasons. The color change was not due to change in the genotypes within the tree populations, right? So the tree's DNA, and yes, trees do have DNA, the tree's DNA did not change. They just had black soot landing on them, right? It's like if you got dirty, your DNA is still the same. The moths, on the other hand, their DNA across the population changed. That's evolution, a genetic change across the population. Okay. Natural selection and alleles. Natural selection includes the following principles and processes. Organisms produce more offspring than their environments can support. That's important, all right? Now we have competition. Not all individuals in this population will survive. If you have a whole lot of animals, let's say 20 animals, but only enough food to support 10 of them, then 10 of them are going to die. 10 of them are going to live. If you have enough food to support 15, then 15 will live and the other 5 will die. The more competition you have, the greater natural selection is going to have an effect because now you're competing and your better traits will help you survive. Ones with the not as good traits will not survive. Offspring vary in phenotype. Some offspring are better able to survive in the environment than others. That goes back to the competition. If your traits are better, you live. Much of the variation in phenotype is caused by differences in the alleles inherited by individuals, meaning your DNA tells you what to look like, right? We have a variation of DNA, therefore we have a variation in phenotypes. The inheritance of alleles determines how likely an individual organism is to survive and reproduce. The inheritance of alleles, meaning which ones do you get? Remember, mom has 2 alleles, dad has 2 alleles. They each only give you 1. So which ones do you get? We talked about that last chapter. It's kind of random. So if you're lucky enough to get the good ones, then you'll have the good traits. If you're not so lucky, then you'll have the bad traits. The ability for some organisms with certain alleles to survive and produce more offspring will lead to a change in allele frequency in the population. Over time, more individuals will have the helpful alleles, just like the moths, all right? It used to be being lighter colored was better. Then it wasn't anymore. So the light colored ones started dying, and the black colored ones were surviving and reproducing. Over the next couple generations, we had more black ones than light colored ones. That's natural selection. And all of these things are going to encourage natural selection to happen. Very important. Remember, That an organism's phenotype is influenced by the alleles it inherits from its parents. In most species, each individual has two alleles for each gene. Remember, one from mom, one from dad, and they may be either the same or different, homozygous or heterozygous. Right? Call back to last chapter. During reproduction, alleles from parents recombine in offspring, giving the offspring different combinations of alleles and traits than their parents. Because remember, codominant, incomplete dominant, sometimes these traits blend. Polygenic traits, they blend. So the little you get from mom and the little you get from dad may blend in a new, cool way that didn't exist before, at least didn't exist in your parents. Your mom probably has straight hair, your dad probably has curly hair. They blend in you and you get wavy hair. That's something brand new. In the case of the peppered moth, a single gene determines coloration. Assume for the sake of simplicity that the gene has two alleles, one for black, big B, and one for speckled, little b. So that means little b, speckled, is going to be our recessive trait. For many generations prior to Industrial Revolution, the speckled phenotype provided better camouflage. Therefore, moths with little b genotype were more likely to survive. We still got black ones with big Bs, but they got eaten. And birds saw them and ate them. So the little b ones survived. They reproduced and they passed the little b allele on to the next generation of moths. Because the little b allele occurred at a very high frequency, meaning you saw it a lot in all the animals. Almost all moths had speckled phenotype. When the environment changed, however, new selection pressures acted on some of the moth populations, leading to the change in allele frequencies. The ability for black moths to blend into soot-covered trees gave them an advantage over the speckled moths. Right? So the environment changed. Remember, natural selection is based not just your traits, it's also how well those traits work in the environment. In this case, the environment changed, so the traits were no longer good. Some other trait was good now. Each year, black moths survived and reproduced more often than speckled moths, passing on the alleles at a greater frequency. In the generations that followed, a higher percentage of moths had the big B or big B little b genotypes and the black phenotype. We are going to have a project based on this idea coming up soon. How well do certain alleles pass on and why? So natural selection acts only on phenotype. Important thing here, I believe this ends up being a Keystone question, so pay attention. Natural selection acts only on phenotype, but ultimately affects the genotype of the entire population, meaning your environment doesn't care what your DNA looks like. Your environment cares what your body looks like, your phenotype. Just like the moth, it didn't care that the moth was little b, it cared that the moth was speckled. And that's what helped it survive. And then when the trees got covered in soot, that's what caused them to die, being speckled, the phenotype. But because all the speckled ones were dying, now we had a change in the genotypes because anyone that was little b died out. So the big B's started surviving. So the population's genotype increased because the phenotypes were being affected by the environment. That's what this means. And that's pretty much what I just explained, so we don't have to read that. And that is natural selection. Natural selection is the most common cause of evolution. But there are other causes, other mechanisms that's going to affect it. So let's talk about some things here. First off, a key word, population, which by the way, definitions are on the side. If you get lost, you can pause and look at it. And I think I had some up here as well. Yes, I did. All right, allele frequency. So look over on the side for side notes. You can pause it. This is a YouTube video. A population is a group of organisms of the same species that share a geographic area and breed together, right? That's a population. Same species, live together, having kids. Right? As the pepper moth example shows, natural selection can change the frequencies of alleles in a population. However, there are other ways in which allele frequencies may change. Genetic drift. refers to change in allele frequencies that are due to chance events. What do I mean by chance events? What is a chance event? It means, oops. No, sir, that's it. Oops. Something happened. Something unexpected happened. Your traits had nothing to do with it. All right. You can have the absolute best traits for your environment, but if you're caught in a landslide, that had nothing to do with your DNA. Right? That's a chance event. It's a one-time thing. It's not normally part of your environment. A meteor fell and killed you. I don't care how good your traits are. A meteor is going to kill you. Right? That's a one-time chance event. You accidentally walk in front of a hunter's rifle. All right. That rifle was not part of the normal environment. It was a one-time thing, chance event. That's what we call genetic drift. Something random happening. For example, consider a bird population that colonizes a cliffside once a year to nest and lay eggs. A landslide may eliminate the portion of the population. If, just by chance, more of the birds in the landslide area have a certain allele, that allele's frequency will decrease. All right. Say we have white birds and black birds. All right. Neither trait is better than the other. They're both equally good. It just happened that the white birds got caught in the landslide. So now there are less white birds in the DNA, in the gene pool. Right? The population has more black birds now. Genetic drift produces changes unrelated to the allele's impact on survival and reproduction, meaning the DNA had nothing to do with that. They were in the wrong place at the wrong time and they got killed by a landslide. It does not cause any steady direct increase or decrease over generations as natural selection does. Right? This is a one-time thing. It may even fix itself later. It may not. We don't know until it happens. The simplest way for an allele's frequency to change is through migration. All right, this is different. This is not genetic drift. This is a new thing. Migration, the movement of individuals into or out of a population. These individuals bring their alleles with them. If the population is small, the effect of even a small number of migrating individuals can be great. Meaning, let me reread this real quick. Yeah, so if a small group of animals goes someplace else, they're going to bring their genetics with them. So they enter a new population, they're going to introduce new genes to that population. This is especially true if, by chance, migration removes a rare allele from a population. So that means when the animals migrate to a new population, they left the old one. The old population has lost that DNA. So there's a rare allele, say a group of people, mostly brown eyes, and maybe a small handful of them have blue eyes. If the blue-eyed people up and leave, there's no more blue-eye alleles. Gone. Migration has just changed that gene pool. When those blue-eyed people go to a new population, they added blue-eye alleles to that population. They changed that population. Migration just changed two populations, the ones they left and the ones they went to. Sometimes several members of a population may leave a geographic area and found a new population, meaning they didn't enter a new population. They left one, but they couldn't find a new one to enter. So they make their own. Their allele frequencies will, by random chance, differ from those of the original population. I think I read this wrong. Yeah, sometimes several members of a population may leave a geographic area and found a new population, right? Their allele frequencies will, by random chance, differ from those of the original population, which still exists. The new population's allele frequencies will reflect those of the founding population rather than the original population. Meaning you get a whole bunch of those blue-eyed people leaving the brown-eyed group. The brown-eyed people still exist. They're just not in that area. The blue-eyed people are going to a new area. They say, I claim this land in the name of blue-eyed people. And now they start a whole population of blue-eyed people. That's called the founder effect. The uncommon alleles in larger original population are less likely to include the founding group, meaning the blue-eyed people are not very likely to pass on brown eyes. That's what they're saying. The founder effect decreases the genetic variation of a new population by reducing the number of different alleles. So the original population is over here has these black stars, these white stars, and these green stars. The black stars and white stars move over here, but not the green stars. So the new population has less variation. There's less chance of being different. That's founder effect. The group looks like the people who founded the area. Similarly, a population bottleneck occurs when an entire population is reduced to just a few individuals, often as a result of some form of disaster such as disease. Kind of hitting home today. These smaller populations have less genetic variation than the original larger one. Even when the small population increases in size, its genetic variation will remain low. For example, cheetahs have extremely low genetic variation due to their population having gone through a population bottleneck 10,000 years ago. There used to be a whole bunch of different kinds of cheetahs. Now there's only really one kind of cheetah. That's a population bottleneck. There could be a lot of cheetahs, but they all look kind of the same. We may be facing a population bottleneck nowadays. The news recently was talking about how COVID-19 may be affecting people who are African American more than other people. They didn't specify why. They weren't really sure why, but some theories included the areas where where most African Americans live are more densely populated and help them spread the disease. They weren't sure if that was the cause or if it was a genetic reason. But for whatever reason, COVID was affecting African Americans more than other groups. So if those individuals die, we would start to see a population bottleneck, less African American genes in the gene pool, and more of something else. There are other people. So we have decreased our variation. Hopefully that doesn't actually happen though. That's just what they were talking about on the news. All right. Moving on. Speciation. Let me see how far we go on this. Actually, we are going to stop here. The questions that are on the Google form only go up to page 163. Okay? And then I'm going to continue on with this on a later date.